Hey, welcome back. We're continuing where we left off in the last tutorial, where we had this card which we can play, seemingly, but when we do so, we see no minions are targeted, and when we play it, it does nothing, and also when we exit, we get an error that tells us that we are seem to be missing a targeting component. So that's what we have to look at next. How do we get the appropriate targets? So we can, of course, set this up on our card. Let's look into BP card and see where this is actually used. So if we go to the event graph, so where we were last was that we had checked resolve the user rule consequences. We had started playing the card. We are going past these repetitions. We'll get back to this. And then going to the card effects. So we will be looping through all of the card effects in our card, which are the ones you will find in the card effects array here. That is what is being accessed through here, these card effects. And it is looping through all of them, though not through like a for loop or something like that. I'm doing this manually, and the reason for that is that there might be delays and things like that within this this whole card setup. There are cards, for instance, where you play the card and then the player gets prompted to select specific cards, for instance, that you want the card to target. So because all of this can't happen instantaneously, I can't just do it within a for loop or a function. That's why all of this is in the event graph, and I'm doing this loop iteration manually. But it's similar to what you would see in a for loop, what I'm doing here. So we're essentially looping through all of the card effects, and when we are above or we're at the last index of these card effects, then we break, or we go and continue to the next repetition, which we'll get back to. But in any case, for this particular card, we have one card effect which is giving armor to the player. So that's the one that we are accessing. But before that, the card wants to know, okay, who's going to be targeted by this card? And it does that by looking at the card effects and checking, checking the targeting component class of this, and then trying to access that targeting component class. And if we look at our tutorial card and look at the card effect and the targeting class, we see that we have no targeting class. So we have nothing specified that we can target. So we need to change this to something specific. So for this, we want to add armor, and we want to add armor to the warrior. And the handy thing here is that, there are many different targeting classes, as you can see here, and they are somewhat descriptive, and you can look into them to get more of a description of what they do too. But you can see things like, all opposing. So that means like we're trying to target all of the minions that are opposing our hero, or the owner of the card, really. We can try this one out, by the way. Let's do all opposing. Let's see what happens. So we can drag this card, and we can see now that this minion here, because he's one of the opposing targets or minions, is selected. And when we use this card, nothing happens still. Must be something I've missed. Well, let's find out together. If we go to the card, let's see if we're missing anything. So we're adding armor, effect value, we have our targets, so all that should be fine. Okay, yeah. I guess maybe these should have been named a bit clearer. Maybe I'm going a bit quick for the tutorial, but you see that I'm adding a card status here. So I'm actually trying to add a status to a card. So that's not the status we want to look at. We want the regular add status, which is this one, which looks very similar, but it should be working for our minions. So let's see. Now we're adding armor to this opposing enemy. And since it's all opposing, if we had multiple enemies here, all of those would get the armor status. But that's not what we want for this weird card, I think. So we will change it to the card owner. So the owner of the card, by default, all cards in the deck will be assigned to the hero and at the current iteration of this toolkit, you're assumed to have a single hero. That might be changed at a later point when you're watching this video, but then I will make another video to show how to deal with multiple heroes. But by default, I assume I will still have it set up so that the single hero you have will be the owner of all the cards that you have. So now that we've set it to the owner, you can see he lights up and we can gain armor. So that's working fine. But let's take a closer look at how this targeting works in practice. So if you go back to BP card here, and we look at the event graph, so we're accessing targeting class lazy here. This means that we try to get this targeting class, which is we specify some actor we want to hold this targeting class. I've set it up so that you get the owner of the card by default. So some of this might be subject to change. As you can see from my comments here, I consider this to be somewhat hacky, and it might be changed in a future iteration. But this is how it's currently set up, that we are checking, firstly, do we have a valid owner of this card, which should be the minion by default here. And if we do, then we check if this actor, which should hold this class, do we already have access to this targeting class on this card owner? And if we do, then we just return this targeting class. If not, then we are spawning a new targeting class. So this is a form of lazy access where we only spawn an actor if we don't already have access to it. And I'm attaching this to the card owner, so we don't need every card to add their own targeting component, since that would generally be unnecessary. Though if keeping this in the owner is the best place for this, is something I'm still considering, as you can see, but it works fine for the demo as it is currently set up, and for many games, I will assume. So that's what we're doing. We're accessing the targeting class. So after this part, then we set this temporary reference to this targeting class. Then we check this targeting class. Does this targeting class require input? And this is what I was discussing earlier, that some targeting classes might pause the game, or like not directly pause the game, but will ask the player to provide some sort of input, like say select a card or something like this before we proceed. So if we require input, then we bind this event here to proceeding on targets received, which can be set within a targeting component, which will return the targets that the players have selected. But currently we're looking at a more simple setup where we don't require extra input from the player, because the targeting mode, or the targeting class, which selects the owner, it finds the targets on its own. It doesn't need any additional input from the player, and we'll look at how it does this. So now we have this targeting component, and we have our input targets that were found when we hovered the card, and then we check the effect loop, so we're getting the appropriate effect class, essentially. So which will be, since we have one effect, this is the first effect loop, then we're looking at the first card effect in this card, which is the one that applies armor. It is this effect. Let's see, where were we? I'm getting way too many tabs up here. I'll close them down and we'll open them up as we need them again. So we're then going into that targeting mode, and we're trying to find valid targets. So this is the default setup for targeting mode. It's a bit like the use rules in this, that the parent class for all of these targeting blueprints doesn't have much functionality on its own. It just has these virtual functions set up that are meant to be overridden by child functions. So finding valid targets is the one that we're looking at currently, which is the most important one here, where we're getting these specified targets, these targets that were input, that were found when the card was dragged onto the screen. And generally we want to loop through all of those and return those that are valid. So we can look at the specific targeting class that we're using. If we go here to targeting modes and targeting card owner, we can see for find valid targets, it's quite simple. We get the owner of the card. If it's valid, then we return this as the targets we want to target, so this will be an array of a single target, which will be the owner of the card. So other targeting modes will be more complex, have other ways of returning multiple targets, finding target minions that have a specific gameplay tag, for instance, or waiting for the player to provide input, like I mentioned, etc. So you can look at the various kinds of targeting modes here for more complex examples. For this, we're using the more simple one of the more simple targeting modes, which is just finding the owner. So at this point, current valid targets will hold just the owner of the card, which will be the warrior hero. And at this point, it will continue to the next target, and the next target will be the first target in this case, and the only target, which is the hero. So it continues. So this is a similar kind of loop to what we're seeing with the effect loop, only here we are looping through all of the targets. Now we only have one target at the moment, so this will then stay at 1, or actually it will stay, let's see here, if I can find where this is set. Yeah, you can see that it's set to -1 earlier, so for this first increment here, it will be set to 0. And then we check, okay, is this, are we beyond the amount, or we are incrementing this each loop through all of the targets. At some point we will go beyond all of the targets, and then we will break and go to the next card effect if we have multiple effects. But first, when we're going through this the first time, we are set at the target loop index 0, and we will see that the last index, that the target loop index, which will be at 0, is so the last index is not greater or equal to this index. So we are allowed to proceed. And then we are accessing the card effect at the effect loop index. And now we get to the point where we want to soon actually use this effect. First, we create a copy actually of, or we create a new card effect, which is also a component. So this is added temporarily and used for this card effect. So this is a bit different from what we did with the use rule or the targeting components. In that you see that we are adding a new card effect actually each time. Like with the use rules, we saw that we added all of those to the cards at setup. While with the targeting class, we are actually getting those from the owner of the card, or creating them the first time if they have not already been accessed by another card before. But for the card effects, we actually create a new one each time we are using that card effect. And the reason for this is that these card effects are set up so that they might be modified. So in that, so for instance, you might have an attack effect, and this attack effect has a damage value, it has an effect value. And when you use this on a minion, an enemy, and that minion has armor, then that armor will reduce that effect value as it is coming in. So, and then it will try to reduce the opponent's health. So at that point, it will have a lower effect value. So that means that the card effect can actually be affected by the process of the card effect being executed. So if we just created a single card effect and held it here in BP card, then later uses of this card will be affected by its earlier uses. To take the same example, if the damage of the card was reduced by the armor of the opponent, the next time you use the card, this component will still have its effect value reduced. So because of this, we are creating a new status, a new card effect component each time they are accessed. And we're setting this as the current card effect. We are checking if this effect is immediate. So this is similar to checking the targeting classes, in that we might have some kinds of card effects where we actually want to wait for player input or some other delayed event before we proceed. But for most of them, they will be immediate, which we can specify within the card effect class. And then we will continue with executing the card effect, but not before we have created a card action to show any visuals we want to display for using this card effect. It's been a little while since I've looked at our flowchart, so things are getting a bit complicated, I can understand. So we'll take a look at this, hopefully it helps a bit. So you saw that we resolve all the used consequences, we loop through all the repetitions, now we're looping through all the card effects, and for each card effect we are finding the targets for this card effect through its targeting rule, which we did earlier. And then we check, does this targeting component require input? If it does, we wait for player input and wait until input is received before proceeding. If not, as in this case, if we get the target automatically from the targeting component, then we just keep all of those targets and we loop through all of the targets, which in this case is just the owner of the card, the warrior hero. And then we create a card effect instance, as I just described. And now we're getting to the point where we're queuing a card effect action. So let's take a look at what that means. So the card effect action is responsible for showing, by default, it's responsible for showing the puppet animating for using the card and displaying any particle effects. Though you can create your own effect actions that have other forms of visualization or sounds, etc. As well. But this card effect action, it takes some input. It requires, a target actor, or it can get that. So which actor are we targeting? And we're also getting the source, which is the puppet that is owned by the owner of this card. So that will be the warrior puppet, which is owned by our warrior minion. You'll have to look at my tutorials on minions to get more of an explanation of this, but essentially the puppets, those are the skeletal meshes or the blueprints that hold skeletal meshes. So those are how minions are visualized in the game. Minions, similar to BP card here, aren't visualized in themselves, they are just for game logic. But just like the card has its widget to display it in the game, minions have puppets to display in the game. So for this card action, we get these puppets from the target and from the owner of the card, so we can use those to animate anything we need on the target and the owner. And we also input the current card effect to this. And in here we are spawning a card effect action, which is responsible for visualizing all of this stuff. So at the moment we have none of that set up. So when we play this card, you see that we only get this, this splash and this armor, but we're not animating and we have no particle effects or anything like that. We can change that in the data. So going back to then the data and cards and the tutorial cards, we can find our card effect, and we can find here then the effect action. Is there any effect action used? And we can set this to the only one that exists by default, which is this one. The recommended way to add your own kind of visualization visual stuff is to create child actors of this. So you can select it down here, and then we can have an animation. So for this, maybe we have the block animation. I mean, we're gaining armor, so it makes sense. And also a particle effect. We just have an explosion particle effect, so it's gonna look pretty weird, but then you can see how it works. Now our hero should play a block animation, and an explosion should happen on the target of the ability, which is also this hero. So there, and he's exploding and gaining armor. So that part is working, and this is handled within this this action. So to understand how actions work, you'll have to look at my tutorial for the action system. But essentially, an action is an actor that is responsible for displaying something visual in the game on a queue. So you have lots of actions that are queued up and then they play out one after another. So it will spawn then, in this case, the BP action effect. We can find this here under card actions, BP action effect, and you can see what it does here. So I won't go into this in great detail, but you'll see that it will have an animation as input, which it gets from the data. It then plays this animation on the puppet, and then it continues and spawns any effect particles that are held in this action. So that's generally how this works in broad terms. But yeah, in order to keep this brief, and since this is not the core of how the game logic and the card works, I'll continue to the next part in this tutorial, which is actually resolving the card effect. So finally we are where the game logic part of this card happens, unless we also consider the use consequences from the use rules at the start. This is where most of the important stuff of the card actually happens. So now we resolve a card effect, and that can be resolved in any number of ways defined within the card effect actors, act components. So we have our current card effect as the target, and for this we resolve a card effect with our current target in this loop as the target actor, which in this case will be our hero warrior. So this is similar to what we've seen with the targeting rules and with use rules, etc. That the BP card effect parent doesn't have anything really set up in resolving the card effect. It's just here to be overridden by child blueprints. So we can look then at, and we already have actually at this, let's see, the add status. Now I have to be careful not to go to the wrong one with check mark here. And add status. And we've looked at this one before, so I've explained this, but now we also know how we're getting the target actor, how we're accessing this. And we're adding this status to this target actor, which is the armor status. And you'll have to look at my tutorial for statuses to understand how adding statuses works. But here we are at the end point of how this card loop works. After this, we are destroying the component. It is also destroyed if we don't have an immediate effect. It just happens after we have resolved the effect of the card, which might have a delay, like I mentioned. But in any case, we are always destroying the component here, this effect component, after we're using it. Like I said, we're always making a new one anyway. So just for some garbage collection there. And then we're continuing to the next target. And that takes us back to this part here, where we are continuing this target loop, and we're finding the next target among our valid selected targets, which in this case is nothing because we just had a single target. So therefore we continue to the next effect, and we go back again, and then we increment the effect loop. And since we only had one card effect in this card, then we do not continue. And then we continue to the next repetitions. Now we're back to repetitions here. Now we can actually look at this. So this is relatively simple. If you need a card that repeats its effect several times, it's very useful for things like monster attacks, which are also based on cards where they do multi-attacks. But there's also a multi-attack card included for the player by default in the toolkit. But we can now change this in our tutorial cards and just add a couple of repetitions. So 2 repetitions, that means it's going to happen 3 times because it's repeated 1 and 2 times. And if we play this card now, we should be applying armor 3 times to our hero, and each time, he explodes. So that's how that works. Let's take a look at how that looks in code. So this is similar to the other loops that we've seen here, that we are incrementing our current number of repetitions each time in this loop here. And then we're checking, okay, the number of repetitions we have already done, are those lower or equal to the number of repetitions we have in our card data? If they are, then we want to continue and repeat this card effect on all valid targets until we are done with our repetitions. And this is the point at which we are finished using the card, but now we handle the post card use consequences. So that's something that's specified also in the card. You can find that in the data. So we have our let's see, post use event here, which is set to discard. This is used by the event system. See my tutorial on that, to tell the event system that this card wants to be discarded. This is something that is picked up by the card in the hand pile, actually, the hand of the player, so which then is responsible for actually discarding the card. So you could do the same thing here, discarding a card by creating a new card effect which targets this card and tells that card to be discarded. And you could add that, for every card you can add an additional card effect which tells the card to be discarded. I had it like this initially when making this kit, actually, but since you want to add that to every card, it becomes so cumbersome. So I added this simpler way of specifying an event that happens after the card has been used, which you can use for that purpose. Though you can still clear this event and do this manually within the card effects. Have a discard card effect in here, and we'll do the same thing. But you have others that are set up. You can choose exhaust here, and if you do that, then when playing this card, we'll see that after it is played, it gets exhausted and goes in the exhaust pile. Now, maybe I should explain that a bit more. I'll just assume that you've watched the event system tutorial. If not, you can watch that and get back to this, of course. You can see here that we are calling this event in the global dispatcher hub, and we're calling the post play card event. And that's not the one I mentioned here. This is just a general event that tells the event dispatcher we have just played a card. You might use this for any number of things. For instance, I use it for the final blow card, which gets its costs reduced every time we use another card, and it binds to this event. But we also call this post use event in the global dispatcher hub. So this might be, or in the case of our card here, it is the event card exhaust effect, and we can search for this event to figure out where this is actually used. So we can do Control Shift F. I have to do that inside here, I guess. Okay, maybe I forgot the shortcut. We can, in any case, use find in all blueprints, and we can search for event. I'm in all caps. Let's see. Event card exhaust, and you can see each time it's used here, and we want to figure out where it is bound, and we can see that in the hand component it is bound, and in this hand component you can see that when so this is bound to the global dispatcher hub, that each time this exhaust event is called, and it's called on a specific object. In this case, it will be called on self, which is the card. The hand component here will, in this exhaust event, take this card, and it will first it will check that this card is actually in our hand that we want to exhaust. And if it does, then it will transfer this card to the exhaust pile. And it will also call an event action exhaust, which is used by the card widget to display the exhaust animation. And it also resets any in-hand modifications. If we have buffed the card in hand, those get reset when it's moved to the exhaust pile. So yeah. That last part might have been very confusing if you haven't seen my tutorials on the event system or the action system. So go and watch those to understand that part. But for this tutorial, this is the end point of using the card. As we have gone through this whole flowchart at this point, we can go to the parts we didn't reach here. So we were at the point where we're queuing an effect action, and then we resolve a card effect within the card effect blueprint, and then we keep looping through all of the targets, applying the card effect. When we've done that to all targets, then we go back to and see if we have any more card effects. We loop through all of those, and we keep looping, and then when we're done with that, we see, okay, do we want to repeat this? And then we loop the entire thing until we are out of repetitions, at which point we resolve any post-use consequences, such as discard, as it's mentioned there. And then we're actually completed with this large, fairly complex sequence of events, which represents how cards work in this toolkit. So I understand if this might seem quite complex, but it is designed this way to be extremely modular, and that you can do a huge number of different things in this by changing the various kinds of components that are referenced. You can completely change the behavior of a card, and this is why cards are used for so many different things in the toolkit, from the behavior of monsters to the rewards after you've defeated an encounter, and many other things. That cards can be designed in incredibly flexible ways, with different ways of handling their costs, of how they are targeting, if they're targeting cards, if they're targeting minions, etc., etc. So hopefully through this you can see some of the power and flexibility which is in this card system. But I understand that, this will take some practice, and need to try different things out. And I will be making more specific tutorials, to going into creating more specific effects, etc. But as always, you can always ask me questions in my support thread or on Discord if you have any particular card in mind that you really want to design, but you're struggling to get it to work within the system. Then I will do my best to help you out in figuring out how you can achieve the effect you're after. So with that, I think that's the end of this video, and I'll see you in another tutorial.